Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Speaking of transit and parking, right now we run a trolley system in the downtown area, and very popular. We have over 500,000 loading per year on our trolley system. About 2 years ago, we were invited to participate with PalmTran and the RPM study, with their route optimization study. And at that point, we went through a very detailed transit study. Essentially, in transit planning, there's like two pieces to it, right? You can, with finite, limited resources, you can have a coverage model or a ridership model. And what that means is a coverage model is everybody gets a service access, but not very frequent. Or you could go with a model that is frequency, high density in areas that will serve. At the time, PalmTrans, serving the overall county level, they decided to go with a coverage model. And so we thought, hey, this would be a good opportunity for the city of West Palm Beach to complement PalmTran and fill in all the gaps and serve our community better. So we hired Jared Walker and Associates, which is internationally acclaimed for his transit planning. He wrote a book on the Human transit. And we thought that it would be a really good transition as we are using the same consultant that PalmTran is using to design our study. Before I get into the details of it, I just want to say that what I've learned out of this process is that if you want successful transit, there's really two things that goes into it. It's frequency and density, right? Where you run the buses and the trolleys where the people are at. And so when we go through this, keep in mind we have a goal, and our goal is to provide additional job access to the downtown area. And for then, our focus is to provide better job access, and how do we connect communities reaching north and south and all the way out west, which there's limited resources right now that connects our people into our downtown area. So we started this process quite a long time ago because it's a very thorough and very comprehensive study to really beginning the discussion on, first is on parking. It's like, can we look at our assets? How do people get into the city? And the majority of people still drive, and so how do we offsite those mode? And as you can see here, during that process, we did two public survey, one in this room in particular, and another one on the online. In addition to that, we presented to all the boards, the chamber, the TPA, and throughout the county to really gain their feedback, to collect information to say, will this work and how can we implement this? So to simply put it, we broke it down to three phases if we're interested in expanding transit in the city. So the first year is essentially adding 2 new trolleys, which we already received a grant for it. It's already being purchased. Right now, based on our schedule, we're thinking of January as implementation and really rerouting the downtown network, and how we can reach into more of the PBAU market all the way up to the Northwest neighborhood and connecting those neighborhoods. Year 3 expansion is very, very important because this is going to be the first time that we're reaching out west. So if you know that PalmTran itself, the US 1, Route 1 is along Dixie and Broadway, highest ridership. Their other ridership is all the way out to Military Trail. So there's really not much of an east-west connection, and so year 3 really will connect that. And essentially year 5 is going further into the neighborhood. But ultimately, if based on our study, if we follow through with this transit study, we're looking to improve 94% of job access into the downtown area. So again, year 1, this is a little bit further in detail. One of the most interesting thing that I found is we have a tracker on our trolley and to see how many ridership and loading we have. And we found that the top 5 riderships or loading is actually in the Northwest neighborhood. So if you can think about it, the only food access that these people have is really the Publix downtown. And outside of that, I believe it's the Whole Foods all the way in Palm Beach Lakes. The other thing is we met with the student body president at PBAU, and this is a really, really good market because these students lived in downtown and they live in other areas that they really just need a connection. And then last thing I want to point out is that we have had several conversations on how do we reach into Grandview Heights and the neighborhood down there, and especially the convention center, and how do we get our convention goers into the core downtown area as we're connecting them to Clematis. So I think the year one reroute is very exciting for us because we are able to tap into 3 different markets that we don't have currently. Year 3, though, is, it's really interesting because, as I was saying, Route 1 and Route 3 and Palm Tran itself is the higher of all frequency, but the east-west connection is really tough. There are some routes, like I believe Route 43 is an hour in frequency. So it's very challenged. So what we're proposing is really, one, is to use the Palm Beach outlet and the shopping center just south of Westgate right there on Okeechobee as the parking ride, right? So how do we get people to do that mode shift? And there is an existing parking ride already at the Palm Beach outlet, so how do we expand on that? And then ultimately, Route B, which currently we have one blue route that goes all the way to Northwood, we want to connect that into still connect directly from Northwood into downtown, but then taking it south down to Dreer Park and the public shopping center down there. And then ultimately, year 5, we want to connect the hospital and the golf course that we're working on right now. So, we briefly just talked about what is the future of transit, and I know we have very strong sustainability goals and how do we create a clean environment. But earlier, this is a transit stop, and we're very happy to receive quite a bit of grant funding already up to this point. About 4 years ago, I applied for a grant funding to build out some of our trolley stops that we have in the downtown area. We were awarded $500,000 to build out those stops. In addition to that, we also, at the same year, we received funding to purchase trolleys. And so this is a very important conversation for us to have. Is the future electrification? How do we do that? And so that's a different discussion for another day. But ultimately, let's think about how much is this going to cost us? This is a very, very costly program. So 90% of transit and transit operation itself is in the operations of it. The capital cost is very, quite frankly, not comparable. But right now, we looked at our existing system and how much it's going to cost and the expansion theoretically. So we looked at what are we, right now the CRA and the DDA is actually funding the project. And earlier, as mentioned, Rick and Anna talked about the transit operation funds that's already established, and we already have been working with developers and collecting funding to help us with the operations. And then lastly, we look at parking and parking revenue as it is an enterprise fund to assist us with this expansion. So we're looking at the parking rate structure. So you might want to say, what about mobility fees? There's all this discussion about mobility fees, but really mobility fees cannot pay for operations. It can only pay for the capital cost of it. So how do we get that? The first thing I want to talk about is quickly about the park, the transit operation funds. And part of our ordinance that we established is 2 levels of parking maximum between the soft and the hard max. And between there, we collect a fee that has been calculated based on the use of to answer your question earlier, based on the use of the usage, and there's a fee developed. And what that does is actually looked at the trips that's coming into a particular area and offsetting that trips and equating that to a dollar amount. The other thing that we did is, this is 2 years ago, we did a parking study, and that's there was discussion. It's what is our usage in our downtown area? And we look at from a daily use versus an events, and we're very lucky to have a lot of events that, it's very popular downtown. But on an average daily uses, we're only about 61% utilized as a system-wide. And we looked at it not only our assets, but it's the private assets also. But when we look at parking, it's kind of like real estate, not all parking spaces are created equal. So of course, people want convenient. They want to be able to go to a restaurant and find a parking spot within that block. So how are we going to look at like optimizing the parking rate structure itself to enhance the user experience within our system? So we looked at SF Park, which they've done an incredible job over there. And how do we incorporate a lot of those recommendations into our study? And we looked at looking at demand-based pricing. And what that means is, like I said, not all parking spots are created equal. So the more popular ones are going to be adjusted, and the ones that's not as popular are going to be reduced to shift the demand, because everybody has a different rate. So we've met with the merchants quite a bit throughout this process, and more recently we met with them in August, at the end of August, and we developed and fine-tuned our parking policies with them. One of the things that is recommended is, hey, let's turn the garage into first hour free to encourage better commuter to come in and shop to look at that. The other thing is during event parking, and we had this really lengthy discussion with the DDA. How do we, let's not increase events parking, because our original recommendation is, hey, we need to increase events parking to create more availability. So we agreed, we heard loud and clear of our merchants. So we are actually reducing our events fees along here. And then lastly, it's employee, is there anything that could accommodate employee parking itself? And I'll go back to this slide. But we looked at, yes, there are a lot of service employees that work downtown, and how do we encourage better behavior? Because what we found is right now on-street parking after certain hours, because it's free, the employees are parking on street. And so we're proposing to give half off of monthly night employees, and to help mitigate some of that concern that we've heard. There's some other things as office employees and bulk parking that we're offering to encourage economic development. I want to go back to this because one of the things that we are proposing is to extend our on-street to midnight, very similar to City Place. We want to be consistent as we survey different entity around this area. But we are really, what we're proposing is eliminating hourly, because right now it's you put in a couple hours and it's fixed at maybe $1.50 an hour on street. But we're looking at progressive rates, as in these rates are designed to change behavior. So if it's after 2 hours, it's actually cheaper to park in a parking garage. So if you're a long-term parker, we want to shift those demand into the parking garage and create more availability. And then lastly, it's there's this discussions like, hey, we're making a lot of changes on parking itself and the parking structures. So we need to create a parking benefit district in our downtown area, because right now it's not very defined very well of what parking revenue can go to. And so one of the things that we've already awarded as the parking and lighting and parking guidance system, that's going to be very exciting for us. So we'll know how many availabilities are there already. We've already started, as you probably seen, that there are some wayfinding signs already installed to help direct people to the parking garage. But the more, the more detailed discussion as we're moving, as we're progressing, is like curbside management. How do we help, with TNC, Uber and Lyft? How do we get them to be organized? How do we get freight loading and unloading and organize those strategies on our street? And then the bigger question is can we use this parking benefit district funding to expand our trolley service, and then ultimately implement mobility as a service, as it is like an emerging trend where we connect all mobility solution in one application. I want to say that as we're talking about expanding the trolley, we looked at, hey, what about if we collect fees and revenue? At this point, we are not proposing to collect fees. Our trolley system will be free as it is. And then ultimately, as we're moving into the future, we're hoping to implement more technology-based into our city. And so there are some questions that we hear as we've met with each one of these commissioners already about 3 months ago, that how do we want to progress as we're finalizing these recommendations. And these are the 3 questions that I am seeking for clarification from the mayor and commissioners. So the first question is like, do we want to expand trolley service to be outside of downtown rather than just serving the downtown area? Second is like, what is your comment with the recommended strategy? How do we fund it? How do we make it whole as a system? And then lastly is like, how quickly can we do this? Because you know, there's been some discussions of like setting a two-stage a rates adjustment in our parking fee structure, or should we do as quickly as possible?
Commissioners, questions, comments?
Thank you, Mayor.
Mayor?
Thanks for your presentation. So first, foundationally, which I understand that this question has come to us as a commission, but as I see it, I do want to make sure that, I think on the first slide, we talked about our communication, what we had done thus far. I think, and I know you agree, that will continue just to be a very important kind of golden thread, if you will, throughout everything that we do, especially around any changes to, you know, even as small, and I say small is relative, but, you know, going from 7 p.m. to midnight. I'm not saying that that's a bad decision, but I think in how we communicate that, if that is the pleasure of this administration and commission, is those things are going to be super important. So your first question, you know, about expanding the trolley service. I mean, I think we've heard for some time that, especially in areas like the historic Northwest and Coleman Park, Pleasant City, just different areas throughout our city, that there is both a desire and a need. And again, I don't have the answers to that. You're the experts in terms of what that might look like. But I would definitely be on board with looking at expanding the service. But, you know, really taking a step back, I thought some of the conversation was around about how efficient and how do we make better, if you will, our current trolley service in terms of what we're providing. So the answer to the first question for me is yes, but then I think running parallel to that is all the work that it takes to, you know, what is this service going to look like 2 years from now, and how do we support you in that? Because I think we all agree that there's some work to be done about our current system and the way that it works. I'm going to put a period there and just stop. I know there are other questions, but I wanted to just kind of put that out.
Any other thoughts on the first question, commissioners? I mean, I would be in favor of continuing to expand the trolley service. I think that is consistent with what we're trying to do, is to focus on moving people and not cars, particularly in our downtown and throughout our neighborhoods. Palm Tran, I'm glad we're working with them, but I think there are some gaps there that perhaps we can fill. Obviously, the biggest challenge has been and will continue to be funding for the operation, so we'll have to continue to be creative. But if we can move people, and I like the fact that we're focusing on connecting people with jobs, if we could continue to have that as our guiding light to try to connect people from throughout our city to where the jobs are, I think that is a worthwhile goal. All right. Yeah, Commissioner.
I would concur with you, Mayor. I think that any city worth its weight should have a transit system that is commensurate with the quality of the city and life, and the quality of life that we want to provide to the citizens. And so if we can assist, especially the depressed communities in the Northwest and in Pleasant City, we can assist those areas. I think, as the saying goes, that a rising tide lifts all boats, and to give people as many opportunities to succeed is our mission.
Mr. Shove.
Thank you, Mayor. I too am in favor of looking at trolley expansion. The two things I'd like to focus on are equity and efficiency. If we're going to create a system, it needs to be equally accessible to everyone. I know in some of the things we've looked at addressing keenly the issue of Coleman Park and making sure that Coleman Park has equitable access. along with Pleasant City and historic Northwest and other areas of the city. Just going by some of the maps that we've looked at, I want to make sure that I'm on record addressing that area. And then efficiency, if we're also using this to promote transportation to get to jobs, it has to be on time and it has to be frequent, because I can't also be late for my job because the trolley stop was late. So I think when we can start to master those two things, then, I'm in favor of moving forward.
Madam President.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I would agree with those sentiments and appreciate your 5-year rollout plan, because I think, as many of my colleagues have said, I think that the importance of the density and the frequency of the trips, similar to the GEL presentation, that, if it's not every, so many minutes or so many times in an hour, then people are going to stop and go somewhere else or figure out another way. So thank you.
Okay, so I think you have consensus on that. Commissioner Peduzzi.
Just briefly, I'll say that I concur with the expansion of the plan, and if there's some way of also, connecting the western communities also, if we could keep that in mind, at least maybe not in the near term, but at some point of bringing them into the fold.
Absolutely. Okay, so you have some guidance on that.
Okay. The second question is really geared towards the 3 funding sources that we've identified. One of it is still continually work with the CRA and DDA to fund part of the trolley system. Second is the transit operations funds that we've established already. And then lastly is using the parking funds to assist and pay for the expansion of the system. And I think that is the question.
All right, Commissioners, how do you feel about the at least proposed strategy going forward? Commissioner Shove?
Thank you, Mayor. I think some of our discussions today and the previous item demonstrates a little bit about how I feel moving forward. I'm not opposed to taking some parking funds and using it towards the trolley, but I also want to be mindful that we're keeping that balance, so that whenever we're taking a look at how we're using funds, we still have, hard to tell, but the appropriate number of parking spaces are, the appropriate number of parking facilities. But, I just want to make sure that as we do this, we have these conversations frequently about what is that tipping point? What are our constituents saying? That way we're not taking and completely implementing all parking funds over to trolley service, that perhaps trolley service is funding more transportation for tourists rather than citizens, and kind of looking at what that balance is.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I think, let's continue to look at that strategy. I think there seems to be a consensus there. We'll have to, communication is key. Because you're talking about creating some kind of parking district, right?
Yes. So essentially, part of this is maybe we'll go to the next steps on where we're proposing.
I thought you wanted answers to the questions.
Yes. Ultimately, what we're looking for is part of the strategy is adopting, accepting the parking study, and which is already done, but implementing the strategies out of it. So the transit, we want to say yes. We agree to these transit implementation
So yes to that.
strategy.
Okay.
Yes.
How quickly? My view is let's get it done as soon as possible. But let's see what the other commissioners say. Yes, Commissioner Shaw.
Thank you. I think what's important about this is when we're implementing the parking study finds that our rates are congruent with what the study says, but also I would rather see us communicate out a change in a rollout rather than a phased approach, because I think as you start to do a phased approach, our citizens sometimes forget that this was supposed to be a phased approach, and they feel like rates just keep going up and up and up and up. And I think I'd like to see a really robust communication plan for a one-time fee increase, as it may be, and make sure that everyone knows that that's coming and is prepared accordingly.
Commissioner Neary.
Thank you, Mayor. And I think as long as the the parking experience, this experience is commensurate with the increases. And so I think that that's really important. And again, going back to just this theme of of communication and how we communicate it. But at the end of the day, whether it's expansion, whether it's efficiencies, it's us being very clear and methodical and straightforward in terms of why we're doing this, but look what you're getting, so that we all understand that this isn't the same product, right? So we are making some changes, and you're going to feel those changes, but at the same time, your experience is going to be much different, both as a visitor to the city and as a resident or as a business owner in the city. I just think, again, I'm preaching to the choir here. I know we all know that, but I think that that's really important. But I would agree, just, as quickly as we can, given that, we try not to misstep, that we do our very best, but I think sooner the better, obviously.
Okay,
And then lastly,
next steps.
these are some of the, this schedule shifted quite a bit, but here are where we're at. Ultimately, we're looking at January as we spend the next 2 months rolling out a communication plan.
All right, that's very important, the communication plan and getting the word out there before the actual implementation. And I think part of that should be bragging about the changes to the parking experience, as Commissioner Nearing talked about, how we're upgrading that experience for those who are looking to park in our downtown or proposing to upgrade it. All right? Yes.
So that being said, either before or at that October meeting, would we be able to see what those plans are to communicate that?
Yeah, we would have to come back to a work session to talk separately on our approach to communications as
Okay.
we roll this out, yes.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, very good. Look forward to getting more information.